I've talked on this topic for years, and in fact, this is a small audience compared to where I usually talk. And I've been thinking about, on the way in the taxi over here from Harvard Square, I was thinking about why I continue to do this, and it put me in mind of a joke. And since our topic for tonight is heavy and serious, you'll allow me to start with some humor just to make us all relaxed and feel like we're in this together. It's the story of a soloist on the glass harmonica who's the first player on the harmonica to have been invited by the New York Philharmonic to play. And so he decides to play the Bach preludes, and he practices and practices and practices, and the day comes, and he launches into the preludes at the performance, and he receives a standing ovation, and in the back of the room, a small voice cries out, "Play it again." And he says, "Oh, I'm so pleased, ladies and gentlemen, I put so much into this, I will play it again." And so he plays it again, and again a standing ovation, and the small voice in the back of the room, "Play it again," to which he responds, "I'm so delighted with the response, but I'm exhausted, I can't play it again." And the small voice says, "You'll play it again until you get it right." Okay. Now, so that's what I'm trying to get it right, okay? Social suffering, from the way it's used by anthropologists, and this is a term I introduced with my colleagues Vina Das and Margaret Locke some 2 decades ago, or a little over that, has 4 meanings, carries 4 meanings. It's the pain and suffering caused by social forces, and for example, global and local economics, politics, social institutions, social relationships, culture. They all can contribute to social problems and to ill health and to the pain and suffering associated with them. Those of you who are familiar with the idea of structural violence know that that's an example of this first meaning of social suffering. The second meaning of social suffering is to run against the grain of the highly individualist American approach to suffering, and to say that when you actually do empirical studies of suffering, you see that suffering is rarely limited to an individual, but is almost always interpersonal. Take Alzheimer's disease. If you spend time with patients with Alzheimer's who have serious cognitive loss, elderly patients usually, you'll see that they themselves may not even register pain and suffering, so severe is the cognitive loss that they've had. But if you look at their adult children, you'll see they're the people who speak about the suffering and show the pain and the like. The pain and suffering is right between them in that experience. Social suffering also means that the contribution that society and its institutions, like hospitals, like social welfare organizations, like social policy centers, that they themselves make a contribution to the cause or the worsening of social and health problems. Now, we know that in medicine we use the term iatrogenesis. It means illness generated by medicine. But this is a very common phenomena in the social world. And Bob Merton, the late great sociologist at Columbia, called this the unintended consequences of social action. And lastly, social suffering has an omnibus significance as a term to put together the social and the health aspects of everyday experiences and problems that we often separate, because the whole history of professions like medicine, the fields like the social sciences, is to divide and separate, and classify. But this term is meant to bring things together, to say, let's consider that social problems and health problems are so intimately connected they can't be separated. And in fact, if you know anything about infectious diseases and chronic diseases around the world, you know that that poverty, that joblessness, that the various forms of social adversity have an enormous impact on health status, maybe the most profound impact on health status. And here's the violences of everyday life, illustrated through deep poverty. These are the billion people in the world who live on $1 a day or less, and who have to scrounge for a living and have neither food security nor security in terms of clothing nor in abode, and the various kinds of violences associated with that. Now let's get into the sort of the technical details of the presentation I want to make to you. I want to begin with the idea of experience. And the kind of medical anthropology that I do is based in the ethnography of lived experience. And attention to lived experience can take you well into the continental philosophical tradition. The phenomenologists like Helmut Plessner and Arnold Galen and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. But you can go back through the great late 19th century and early 20th century continental philosophers, Husserl and many others, who began with the idea of experience. What is experience? From my perspective, the best argument about experience is Michael Oakeshott's great book on experience. And experience as formulated anthropologically is characterized by an orientation of overwhelming practicality. That is, if we look into our experiences, our lives are overwhelmingly practical. We may be theorists. We may engage in speculation on a regular basis. But when we go out into the world, we've got to make sure we don't get hit on Comm Ave by a bus, that we have enough money with us to pay for a dinner, though I'm hoping to be taken out for dinner tonight, that we have to engage things like paying taxes, like holding a job, like problems that all families deal with. Our lives are filled with practical concern because the world around us has real threats and dangers and uncertainties. So many threats and dangers that we defend ourselves through euphemisms. No physician you've ever met has laid out for you the thousands of ways you can die. Thomas Brown, the great Edinburgh physician of the 18th century, said, "I who have seen 1,000 deaths, thank my God I can die but once." Okay? The dangers around us are remarkable when we begin to add them up. And the uncertainty of our understanding is very substantial. And that's what I want to work with. I want to work with the idea that experience as we actually live it contradicts the media claims by investment bankers and disability lawyers and ambulance-chasing doctors that we know everything, we have control over everything, that we can predict risk. Nothing scientifically could be further from the truth. We have hardly any knowledge of risk, and we have almost no control on it. Now, life from an anthropological standpoint is not only embedded in the setting of practicality, but it is fundamentally moral. Moral understood as not a set of ideas that we have, but the actual value shown in our practices. So you go in a law firm, and the law firm says on its door, "We serve our clients." But you watch the everyday behavior of them, and they screw their clients, and you know that what's at stake for them is making money, not their clients. Okay? And I could take you through every domain like this. This is one reason why there's so much upset with physicians. The fear that physicians really are not interested as much in giving care as they are of taking care of themselves. So in our practices, we show what our values are, what the moral is. I'm at Harvard. I swim with sharks, okay? Experience is realized morally not with a view from nowhere, which is an impossibility in anthropology, but always with being positioned somewhere. And that somewhere is our local worlds. Our local worlds classically were a village setting, a neighborhood, a community. Now our worlds are much more complicated and best described as networks. And those networks can be, and I'll bet you for people in this audience are, transcontinental. We unify them, we pull them together with a cell phone, with Skyping, with all the ways that we stay connected. But the actual moral worlds we belong to may be a small group like a community of scholars working together in a university like this. It might be a department structure. It could be a dormitory setting. It might be roommates in a small household setting. But it also includes networks of close friends and family. So therefore, we belong to several worlds, and all of those, from an anthropological standpoint again, are moral worlds because there are things at stake for the people in them that show the values in our practices. Now, I listed some of the dangers here to be more explicit. I'm not going to go through this because I more or less said it. So I want to make a distinction between two aspects of the moral, as I've just defined the moral. I want to define moral experience as that set of engaged and practiced values that are in the small groups I mentioned. So the way I put it here is that life is about values, just being alive, negotiating important relations with others, doing work that means something to us, and living in some particular local place indicates that moral experience is inescapable. We're enmeshed in it. But also there's the moral life of the individual. This may sound a little naive. I'm not saying that there aren't people who are tone deaf to wanting to do good in the world. There are plenty of such people. But my experience of life into my 8th decade now, and lots of research, is that most people I've encountered, given the possibility for alternatives, would rather do what's right in their world and have a sense that either that meshes with the way the local world behaves or it doesn't. So our imagination of what's the right thing to do, our sense of responsibility about it, our criticisms, which often relate to the fact as to whether our local world shares those values that we wish to enact or do enact. And our actual engagements in those worlds mean that we have a critical reflection on moral experience in the context of our moral life. Now, trying to live a moral life can lead to the awareness that moral experience is wrong, that the experience around us is wrong. I've spent a lot of my career writing about this. For example, during the Second World War in China, Japan organized a biowarfare program that made the Nazis on this particular score look like they were kindergartners. It was a systematic, major biowarfare program. And people belonging to certain military units, military medical units, did things like drop anthrax bombs on populations, major populations, like some of China's large cities, Ningbo, for example, in East China. And then send epidemiologists out, not to help anyone, but to simply calculate the mortality from it in order to determine what would be the most efficient means of killing. Similarly, in those units, just like in the Shoah, people were routinely killed, but they were routinely killed for a scientific reason, to find out at what temperature people would freeze to death. So they froze Chinese to death, determining when they died, at which temperature they would die, in order to support their own pilots falling into the sea and knowing how long they could last in cold water. They did many things that were just terrible, but there were a few people in these units who realized that these were horrible practices. This moral experience was malign, unacceptable, and couldn't go on with it. The situation was so dangerous, very few, if any, stood up and critiqued it directly, but they pulled back in some way. You look at the same thing in Germany during the Nazi period. You see that a philosopher like Karl Jaspers, out to protect his Jewish wife, went into what he called an internal exile, sort of cutting himself off from the experience around him, which was as far as he thought he could go and still remain unimprisoned and alive, et cetera, in that setting. But many people in this kind of setting, if you think now with me, if your thoughts are with me, collaborate. Okay? We collaborate. At Harvard, I was one of the people to take on Larry Summers when he was president of Harvard. And one of the great things I think our faculty did was to get Larry removed because he failed as a moral leader. He simply failed as a moral leader. He's got other qualities, Larry, but as a moral leader, he failed. And but the tendency for most people in most settings, we all know this, is to collude, to collaborate, to go along, to not make a wave that will get us into trouble, because after all, there are substantial dangers in life, and we're concerned about those. Now, in my experience of the world, there are very few heroes. I've had more than 85 PhD students. I've had more than 200 postdoctoral fellows. I've had thousands of undergraduates. And really only two, in my view, are outright heroes. Jim Kim, who's currently president of the World Bank and was one of my PhD students, and Paul Farmer, another one of my PhD students, who runs Partners in Health, a great NGO, and is the icon of global health today. So the implication of the heroic is not really what I have in mind here. What I have in mind here in terms of the discrepancy between the moral life of the individual and the moral experience going on around them is better portrayed by the idea of the anti-heroic. If you're looking for a source for this, a very good source, it's not the only one, is the Princeton literary critic Victor Brombert, who has looked at the anti-heroic in the French tradition. But by the anti-heroic, I mean people who will let their criticism and their sense of contradiction perturb and disturb the local moral worlds they belong to. That's something most of us can do. We can perturb and disturb those worlds that bother us, that we feel are misplaced loyalty toward, or a sense that the wrong thing is being done. Now, in the way that I'm putting things from an anthropological perspective, the moral and the ethical are not the same thing. We need them both. So moral experience, as I just told you, can be malign. It may be about bad practices. Once we have that moral life perspective that is critical of what the moral experience around us is, we then reach for things like principles of social justice and beneficence, like the idea of virtue ethics and our own, in the Chinese tradition, cultivation of the self. And we see that as either an ethical discourse or a aspiration to some set of values beyond the local. And that's very much what I mean by the ethical in this regard. And we need both. The ethical without the moral is irrelevant most of the time. It's hypocritical much of the time. Talk about social justice, but actually we don't relate it to actual injustices and what is its significance for us. I'm teaching a course with a historian of religion right now at Harvard, David Carrasco, on quests for wisdom. And this week we have an outstanding figure in the civil rights movement, Vincent Harding, coming to join us. And we had the students in the class read, the TV show Eyes on the Prize. And Eyes on the Prize, if you remember back, takes you to the very beginnings of the civil rights movement and what was accepted behavior, the local moral worlds of Southerners. Okay? What was an accepted behavior? The way that blacks were excluded, the way that discrimination worked. There were people in those settings who talked about principles, but didn't relate them to the actual situation at hand, that blacks had to sit in the back of the bus, that they could not go up to a counter to be served in restaurants, that they had separate and unequal schools and other facilities. So the ethical by itself is insufficient, and the moral by itself is insufficient. They have to be put together. Now, I want to turn very briefly now to the development of moral science to reform society. That's the origin of social science. I'm a social scientist. I'm an anthropologist. If you go to the origins of social science, if you read Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, or for that matter, if you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you see that Adam Smith begins with moral sentiments, and he premises his classical liberal position, not neoliberal, but liberal position, of the idea of the importance of freedom and of the individual, on the idea that moral sympathies will precede the market. The market can't work from his perspective without there being this moral underpinning for it. Neoliberals forgot that. But so did much of social science. So when C. Wright Mills came on the scene as a great sociologist in 1959 and wrote The Sociological Imagination, he was critical of sociology because of its professionalization, which he saw took it away from the ideas of improving society that the founders of social science had had. The purpose of social science was to describe society, to improve it, to help human beings. But as sociology, anthropology, political science, economics professionalized, they moved away from their concern with moral experience, with ethical principles, and to their professional fetishisms, which focused on methods and on sort of narrow mid-range theories, and on at one point a scientific set of descriptions, at another point a post-structuralist set of descriptions that were meant to be sufficient in and of themselves without helping anyone or doing anything in the world. And Max Weber, in my view, the greatest social scientist of all time was Weber. You remember Max Weber said in 1922 that in the course of the 20th century, institutions would come to replace families as the most important part of society. And they would do that because they had the greatest chance for efficiencies of scale. They would be able to quantify, generalize, and do all those things that at scale in bureaucracies would structure society most efficiently. But there would be a downside, said Weber. we would all be caught in an iron cage of rationality, which we couldn't get out of. And three things would be lost, he said. Spontaneity, which he called rule of thumb, sentiment, and tradition. By tradition, he very much meant religion. Seems to be, oh, there we go. Now, I don't know where BU sits on this, so I'm not talking about BU. I'm not talking about Boston University. Exclude your own university from what I'm now going to say. I'm talking about my university, okay, and many American research universities. So we have lived through, since the 1940s, a fundamental transition in knowledge. This is the IT revolution. And at the beginning of the IT revolution, Claude Shannon, in the 1940s, a great engineer, said, he predicted that knowledge could be engineered, knowledge would be engineered and would change the world. But in order to do so, he said, we would have to strip knowledge of meaning. Because knowledge tied to meaning would be extremely difficult to engineer, whereas knowledge stripped of meaning could be engineered. Okay? And this was a movement for those of us who are concerned with humanistic knowledge, away from wisdom. Think of how most of our colleagues in the university would be surprised if we use the term wisdom today. They don't expect us to use the term wisdom, nor to see it applied in everyday life. And it would move us in the direction of applied science and professional schools. And this has become the dominant mode of the university in our time, so that in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, the major model of the university were the great liberal arts universities. And the public universities followed the smaller private liberal arts universities. But today, if you look at the great public universities in our country, Michigan, Berkeley, etc., you'll see that they follow not the BU's, Harvard's, Princeton's, Yale's, they follow MIT. In Cambridge, we call MIT the world's greatest university east of Central Square. But MIT's model is a radically different model. So let's just think about what that model is. It's a model of 350 academic engineers. 350. Stanford, which comes close to that model, it has 220 academic engineers. Cornell, which also comes close to that model, has also 220 academic engineers. At Harvard, we've gone from about 40 to about 80, and we have plans to go a little bit beyond that, but we're never going to get to 350, okay? Nor will we ever get probably to 220. But the point is that the momentum is in the direction of academic engineering. We just had visit the United States a few months ago. The leaders of one of China's greatest universities, Beida, Peking University, okay? And the leaders presented Peking University in a way that astonished me, since I've worked in China for 40 years. And that is, rather than the great humanistic university that it is, they presented it as an applied science university. And they presented the applied physics, the engineering, the other applied sciences, and the professional schools as the essence of their university. And it's easy to recognize they're following a global pattern. But that placed great pressure on those of us who would deal with the issues I just presented to you about moral experience. Now, I want to suggest a way that we can re-verify humanistic scholarship and concern with moral experience, both in everyday life and in the university, and that's caregiving. First, let's define caregiving. So caregiving is characterized by attention to the needs of others, says the OED, especially those unable to look after themselves adequately. And it has a professional component in health care and social care. Attention to the needs, for example, of the child, the elderly person, the invalided. From an anthropological standpoint, caregiving can be defined ethnographically as the individual and collective human practices of giving care, protecting, supporting in practical terms, offering solidarity, including physical, emotional, interpersonal, and moral assistance. It's necessarily reciprocally linked to the process of care receiving, which is often forgotten, especially for those who have serious diseases. And here are some pictures that you would associate right away with caregiving. This is in the hospital, but it's family caregiving. This is something I've always been impressed with. This is Willem Utemwillen, a Swiss artist who painted his own Alzheimer's disease. Just to show you that this is part of his own caring for himself, his self-care, and the caring for memories and the caring for identity. We see that the pictures get more and more disarticulated and abstracted as the self itself unravels. And these are pictures of the historically of caregiving. This is from this is nursing carried out largely in its origins within the church. This is the idea of the domesticity of care. This is Rembrandt's great. This is Saskia was Rembrandt's wife. This is Saskia in bed with a sickness. This is Rembrandt's great portrait of a caregiver. Ephraim Bueno was a very famous Portuguese Jewish physician in Amsterdam at the time that Rembrandt painted. Look at the sensitivity in the face, maybe the tragic view of life and the compassion and tenderness. This is a great picture by Saluk Fildes called The Doctor, done at the end of the 19th century when there were damn few things that doctors could do practically, but they could be there. And this is a doctor in the home of a dying child. The parents are in the background, you can see. What you can't see too clearly is that the father's hand is on the mother's shoulder as he comforts her in the background. Fildes with the dying little girl for whom he has nothing to offer, but he can be there with her. This is Rembrandt's great picture of the Jewish bride. By the way, for students in the audience, don't go about doing this, will you? Because it'll be misinterpreted. But this is meant to convey the idea of love, of protection. Love is protection. This is Picasso's At the Sick Woman's Bedside. Look at the fusion of the caregiver and the care receiver. Remember the interpersonal structure of care, of suffering and care. Now, in the Western tradition, this is one of the most classical depictions of suffering. The Pietà, the dying or dead Christ in the arms of the Virgin, with the idea that suffering is between them, is in that space between them. Of all the groups in our society in modern times, in contemporary times, to take on the image of a classical religious image of being crucified, it is the Black liberation movement as part of civil rights movement with the idea of time on the cross. A common terminology in the civil rights movement. Time on the cross. Slavery is time on the cross. By the way, if anyone's interested in this particular aspect of our society, there's a great film, 12 Years a Slave, which I strongly recommend you go see. I just saw it the other day and I'm teaching it to a class. I just think it's an extraordinary film. And here's an example of family care around AIDS patients in Lesotho, one of Africa's, if not the poorest country, one of the poorest countries in Africa. Now, as I get toward the end of this, I just wanted to show this. On your right is the only time we know that Pablo Picasso painted the head of a medical student. Okay? And if you look at it, there's one eye open and one eye closed. And what Picasso had in mind was that students come into the world of suffering, the medical student being an example in the world of illness, with both eyes open, awed by the experience that they can share and the narratives given to them. But that over the course of their training, they go from the preclinical to the clinical side of training, they go from the pre-cynical to the cynical period, and one eye closes. At the Harvard Medical School, we say as long as one eye closes, not too bad. The question we have is whether our students are leaving with both eyes closed, okay? So you can say one eye is closed to protect the self against being overwhelmed by suffering of others, which would paralyze a surgeon or a internist who didn't have a critical distance. It's also increasingly the case that that eye is closed in order to protect self-interest, like career and income. But the important thing is the suffering of the patient that pulls the doctor into that caregiving role. I'm not going to go into the Chinese one. The Chinese one is just an example of the fact that you have more or less the same idea in the Chinese setting. So, I'm having a little trouble moving this machine. Oops. So what is caregiving from an anthropological standpoint? So we have levels of caregiving. We have examples would be humanitarian assistance, giving care at the collective level. We have professional caregiving, individual caregivers and receivers. We have self-care. We have family and network caregiving. For example, you may know that 70% of the elderly in our society are cared for either by themselves or by their families, and only 30% are in institutions. Most people don't recognize that. But most of care given to the elderly is given in families and networks in our society. We have folk and religious caregiving of a variety of kinds, and there are probably other examples as well. And the core tasks of caregiving for family, close friends, and the sufferers themselves, which get very much to the idea of moral experience and moral life, are first practical assistance, but also acknowledgement of the other, affirmation of their humanity, emotional support, moral responsibility and solidarity, consultation and coordination with others, and an idea that I don't have time really to develop here, but I think is one of the most important ideas, and that is presence. We see caregiving done amongst family members, and if we see the best examples of professional caregiving, we see that the caregiver is there, is existentially there, not mechanically giving the care, and that's called presence. Caregiving as an existential act defines our humanity and our relations with others. It's one of the things that really matters, and we can show ethnographically across the world that caregiving is that in that existential position. It's a basic response to the context of danger and uncertainty, and hence is part of the definition of the human condition. In practice, for most people who actually give care, it's not the way economists figure it as a burden, though it may be burdensome, but as a way of being in the world. When you ask most caregivers, I spent my entire career studying this subject. You ask most caregivers, why do you do what you do? They'll tell you their answer is very, very similar usually. It was there to do, it was part of the deal, we do it. And it's the doing of care that is the care. Speaking about care is not caregiving. Okay? Lecturing about care is not caregiving. It's the hands-on doing that is the caregiving. It's the practice of caregiving. It's that experience of actually doing it, which is the caregiving. And as I said, in a global culture of cynicism and a sense of misplaced loyalty, of which is so much in our world, caregiving is frequently perceived as one of the truly worthy objects of not just your moral practice, but in terms of the ideal, your ethical commitment, what you ideally could commit yourself to. Now, here's one of the surprising things. Caregiving has very little to do with medicine, okay? Or the other helping professions. If you go into a hospital, you'll see that the giving of care, as I just defined it here, is not what most doctors are doing, and it's even not what most nurses are doing, though there are more nurses than doctors doing it, okay? The doctors are in front of, by and large in hospitals, are in front of PCs like this or iPads, and they're following the case electronically, but they're not speaking to anyone or engaging anyone. Okay? It's one of the sad dimensions of medicine. And nurses increasingly have so many other tasks to do that they're taken away also from the giving of care. So who gives the care? Who gives the care? Family members do, and also those in lower positions of status and income in the hospital. So if you actually go to the Brigham and Women's or the Mass General or the BU hospital system, you'll see that much care in this area is given by Haitian women who work as aides in the hospital, okay? And many other kinds of practices are related to women and also to minority groups. So if you look for, I mean, my wife 2 years ago died from Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's disease. And if you look for home health aides in our community in Boston, you'll find they come out of 3 potential streams, most of them. They may come out of the Catholic Church, and they're often Irish women who have multiple generations of caregiving as an occupation. They may come out of African nurses who have come to the States with nursing degrees but have trouble getting jobs and take on the role of home health aides. Or they may come out of the Haitian community, and you'll see Haitians and other minority groups, usually women, carrying out this incredibly important role. So the gravamen of my talk is that the moral grounds of our lives are tied up with suffering and caregiving. Now, we just went through a healthcare debate in the United States. Okay? And in the course of that debate, we heard from many people, economists, health policy experts, but you did not hear what I just presented to you. You did not hear the voices of the sick and the suffering. You did not hear the voices of caregivers. And in terms of prioritizing values, you don't see the value of caregiving or the value of suffering articulated. This is the Weberian argument, that the institutions have taken over and that their concern is with the rational technical control of the world, not with sentiment, tradition, rule of thumb, or human engagements. And so I bring this to you in a program that combines philosophy and theology as a challenge. If in fact suffering and caregiving are so central to what life is, how is it we have failed to project into the understandings in our society this wisdom, that they're central? And how is it we have failed to argue for the resources, for the policies that would attend to these experiences and outcomes? I can extend that criticism to my own area. So my area, one of my areas is global health. We do a fantastic job in global health in the United States, and our commitment to global health is huge. But how about our commitment to the local neighborhoods we have, and the poor around us, or the homeless, or those who we could deal with in the same way we go over to deal in Africa or China or India? that doesn't have the same centrality, doesn't have the same resonance for us that global health has. In the same way that I'm arguing that suffering and caregiving don't have that resonance. So this is an area that religionists, physicians, philosophers should be contributing to give voice to an area that has a field that has resonances down the ages and is related to wisdom about the art of living. Wisdom that contradicts much in the current society and much in the current university, or at least stands against the grain of both. Thank you very much.